My parents want me to die so my brother can go to college. When I was 8, my brother Jackson won a spelling bee, and my parents threw him a party with 50 guests and a 3-tier cake. When I won the science fair the next month, they forgot to pick me up from school, and I had to walk home carrying my trophy in the rain. That pretty much summed up my childhood. Jackson was the miracle child they'd tried for 10 years to have. I was the accident that happened after they already had him. He got a nursery with hand-painted murals and a crib that cost more than a car. I got a dresser drawer and hand-me-down blankets. Mom kept every report card, every crayon drawing, every baby tooth of his in labeled boxes. My stuff went straight in the trash. By the time I was 10, I'd learned to stop expecting anything. I started taking care of myself completely. Packed my own lunches, did my own laundry, walked to school alone. Jackson got driven in Mom's car even though we went to the same place. I'd watch them pull away while I started my 40-minute walk, backpack heavy with books I'd bought myself from babysitting money. Teachers thought I was so independent. Really, I just had no choice. The worst part was how they'd gaslight me about it. "We love you both equally," Mom would say while sitting at another one of Jackson's hockey games. I hadn't seen her at any of my track meets all season. "You're imagining things," Dad would insist while showing coworkers Jackson's photos, but none of mine. They had a whole shrine to Jackson in the living room. Trophies, certificates, photos from every age. I got one school picture on the fridge that hadn't been updated since 2nd grade. When I was 16, I got into the advanced science program at school. Full scholarship to summer camp at MIT, the kind of opportunity kids dream about. I ran home with the letter, finally something so big they'd have to care. Mom glanced at it and said, "That's nice, but Jackson has a baseball game that week, so we can't drive you." The camp was 3 hours away. She wouldn't miss one of his games to give me the chance of a lifetime. So I got a job and saved every penny for college. I knew by then that they'd never pay for mine. Jackson already had a college fund that Mom talked about constantly. "We've saved $40,000 for his education," she'd brag to relatives. When those same relatives asked about my college plans, she'd say I'd probably get scholarships since I was the bookish one. Like being smart was a consolation prize for being unloved. Then when I was 17, I started getting sick. Bruises everywhere, exhaustion so bad I could barely stand. I ignored it for months because complaining got me nowhere in that house. But when I fainted at work and woke up in the hospital, the tests showed acute leukemia. Advanced enough that the doctors were surprised I'd been walking around at all. For the first time in my life, my parents looked at me like I mattered. Mom cried actual tears, held my hand during chemo, even slept in the hospital chair. Dad took time off work, something he'd never done for my school events but did now that I was dying. They brought me flowers and balloons and teddy bears, all the things I'd wanted as a kid but never got. For 3 beautiful months, I had parents who loved me. The chemo worked, my counts improved. Doctors said I had a fighting chance if we kept going. I started to believe maybe this illness had changed things. Maybe almost losing me had shown them I was worth loving. Mom even said she was proud of how strong I was. I cried hearing words I'd waited 17 years for. Then Jackson got into Columbia. Not with scholarships or financial aid, his grades weren't that good. But it was his dream school and Mom said they'd make it work. The next day, she sat on my hospital bed with that fake concerned face I knew too well. "Sweetie, we need to talk about your treatment costs," she started. "The insurance only covers so much, and with Jackson's tuition." I stared at her while she explained that they'd have to stop paying for my chemo after this round. That Jackson's education was an investment in the future, while my treatment was just prolonging the inevitable. That I'd had a good life, had I, and shouldn't be selfish about Jackson's opportunities. She actually used the word selfish, about me wanting to not die of cancer so her favorite child could go to Columbia. "We'll make you comfortable," she promised, like that was generous. "But Columbia only accepts students once. Your cancer will probably come back anyway." She said it so matter-of-factly, like she'd already decided I was dead. Jackson needed that money for his dorm room and meal plan and spring break trips. I needed it to live, but that had never been the priority. I looked at her sitting there, the mother who'd held my hand during chemo just long enough to feel like she'd done her duty. Now that Jackson needed something, I was expendable again. Worse than forgotten, actively sacrificed. She was literally choosing his college experience over my life, and she expected me to understand. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I grabbed my phone the second Mom left, hands shaking so bad I could barely unlock the screen. The chemo pump beeped next to my bed while I typed medical emancipation minor into the search bar and started reading everything I could find. There were cases, actual cases, of teenagers who fought for their own health care when parents refused treatment. I took screenshots of legal definitions, patient rights laws, stories about kids who won in court. My eyes burned from staring at the bright screen in the dark room, but I kept going, saving article after article about minors seeking medical decision-making authority. The fourth pulled at my arm when I shifted positions, but I didn't care. Every page I read gave me a little more hope that maybe I didn't have to just accept dying, because my parents decided Jackson's dorm room mattered more than my life. By the time the sun started coming up through the hospital window, I had 24 screenshots and a basic understanding of what medical neglect meant in legal terms. My phone battery was at 6%, and my eyes felt like sandpaper, but I finally had something that looked like a plan. Dr. Stone came in for morning rounds around 7, and he took one look at my face and stopped in the doorway. He asked if everything was okay at home, his voice careful like he already suspected something was wrong. I tried to hold it together, but the words just poured out. I told him what Mom said about stopping my treatment after this round, about Jackson and Columbia, about how she literally said my cancer would probably come back anyway, so why waste the money? Dr. Stone's expression changed from concern to something harder, angrier. His jaw got tight and he set down his tablet on the counter with more force than necessary. He asked me to repeat exactly what she said, and I did, watching him get progressively more upset with every word. When I finished, he pulled out his phone and started typing fast, his whole body tense. Dr. Stone told me he was paging the hospital social worker right now, and that I wasn't getting discharged until we figured out every possible option for continuing my care. He sat down in the chair next to my bed and explained in clear terms what would happen if we stopped treatment now. The cancer was responding really well to the chemo. My cell counts were improving. All the signs pointed to successful remission if we completed the full protocol. But stopping now, when we were only halfway through, would be what he called medically catastrophic. He said the leukemia would almost certainly come back within months, probably more aggressive than before, and my chances of survival would drop to basically nothing. He kept emphasizing that this wasn't a situation where we were prolonging the inevitable like Mom claimed. This was stopping a treatment that was actively working and condemning me to death when I had every chance of living. The way he said it, flat and factual and angry, made everything feel more real than Mom's fake concerned voice had. Judith Green showed up less than an hour later, a woman who looked to be in her 40s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense way of moving. She carried a legal pad and introduced herself as the hospital social worker, then pulled a chair up close to my bed and sat down like she had all the time in the world. She told me she'd handled cases like mine before, and something about the way she said it made me believe her. She asked me to start from the beginning and walk her through my family situation, everything that led to this moment. For the first time in my life, an adult was actually listening, not interrupting, not making excuses, just taking notes and nodding while I talked. She had this way of looking at me that made it clear she believed every word, that she wasn't going to dismiss this as teenage drama or family disagreement. When I paused, she asked specific questions about timing, about patterns, about how long things had been this way. I told her everything, and the words came easier than I expected. The spelling bee party with 50 guests and a 3-tier cake versus my science fair trophy that I carried home in the rain because they forgot to pick me up. Jackson's nursery with hand-painted murals compared to my dresser drawer and hand-me-down blankets. The MIT summer camp I couldn't attend because Mom wouldn't miss one of his baseball games to drive me 3 hours. The $40,000 college fund she bragged about for Jackson, while telling relatives I'd probably get scholarships since I was the bookish one. Judith wrote it all down without changing expression. Just asked how old I was when different things happened, how often they missed my events, whether anyone else witnessed the favoritism. She wanted to know about the 3 months when they actually showed up during chemo, then asked what changed when Jackson got into Columbia. I explained about the acceptance letter and Mom sitting on my hospital bed the very next day to tell me they were stopping my treatment. Judith set down her pen and explained that parents legally control medical decisions for minors, which I already knew from my research. But then she said there are emergency provisions in the law for situations where guardians make choices that actively endanger a child's life. She used the term medical neglect, and my stomach flipped because that meant officially accusing my parents of harming me. It meant making this a legal thing, not just a family disagreement. Judith could see my reaction, and she explained that medical neglect isn't about intent, it's about outcome. If a parent denies necessary life-saving treatment to a child, that's neglect regardless of their reasons. She said the courts take these cases seriously because they involve a minor who can't advocate for themselves. Except I was advocating for myself now, and she was going to help me do it properly. Judith pulled out her phone and started making a list of what she needed to gather. My complete medical records from diagnosis through current treatment, the full treatment protocol showing what came next, and Dr. Stone's professional medical opinion about what happens if chemo stops now. She said she also needed to contact the hospital ethics committee, because this situation involved life or death decision-making authority being used against a patient's wishes. The ethics committee could review whether my parents' choice constituted medical neglect and make recommendations to family court. She explained this would all happen fast, within days, not weeks, because the timeline mattered. Every day we waited was a day closer to my next scheduled chemo cycle, and we needed legal clarity before that appointment. She asked if I was sure I wanted to move forward with this because once we started the process, it would get messy and my parents would know I went to the hospital staff. I told her I was sure because the alternative was dying, and I'd spent 17 years being the kid nobody fought for, so I might as well fight for myself. I pulled out my phone and texted Jackson asking him to come visit me alone, without our parents, because I needed to know where he actually stood in all this. I stared at the message for a minute before hitting send, not sure what I wanted his answer to be. Part of me hoped he'd be horrified by what Mom said, that he'd immediately offer to take out loans or defer enrollment. Another part expected him to side with them like he always did, to explain why his education was more important than my life. The message showed delivered, but he didn't respond right away. I watched my phone for a while, then made myself put it down because obsessing over it wouldn't make him answer faster. 3 hours crawled by while I tried to distract myself with terrible daytime TV. Finally, my phone buzzed with his response saying he'd come after his shift at the grocery store where he worked part-time. He'd be here around 7. The message was short and didn't give me any hints about what he was thinking, but at least he was coming. Dr. Stone came back in the late afternoon carrying a folder and looking grim. He handed it to Judith, and I saw it was several pages of typed medical documentation on official hospital letterhead. He'd written out my entire prognosis in clear terms, the kind of language meant for court rather than casual conversation. Continued treatment gave me a 70% 5-year survival rate, which meant 7 out of 10 patients like me would still be alive 5 years from now if we finished the protocol. But stopping treatment now dropped that number to less than 20% within 2 years. Less than 2 out of 10 would make it. Seeing those actual numbers written down in black and white made everything hit different. It wasn't just Dr. Stone saying treatment was important. It was mathematical proof that my parents were choosing to put me in the 20% group instead of the 70% group. Judith read through the pages carefully, highlighting certain sections with a yellow marker. She looked up at me and said this documentation was exactly what we needed, that no judge could look at these numbers and say my parents were making a reasonable medical decision. Someone from the hospital billing department showed up right before dinner, a nervous-looking guy with a tablet who said he needed to review my account. He pulled up screens of numbers and codes that didn't mean anything to me until he started translating them into actual dollar amounts. My treatment so far had cost over $40,000, which made my brain stutter because I couldn't imagine that much money being spent on me. Insurance had covered about $30,000 of it, leaving my parents responsible for roughly $10,000 in copays and deductibles. The remaining cycles I needed would cost another $30,000 total, with insurance probably covering $20,000 and leaving $10,000 in out-of-pocket costs. So my parents were basically choosing to not pay $10,000, and that choice would kill me. $10,000 was exactly what they'd saved in Jackson's college fund. The billing guy kept talking about payment plans and financial assistance programs, but all I could think about was how Mom's choice suddenly made horrible financial sense, even though it was morally disgusting. She wasn't choosing between $40,000 and my life. She was choosing between $10,000 and my life, and she'd decided $10,000 was too much to spend on the kid she never wanted anyway. I spent the next few hours sitting alone with those numbers burning in my brain, trying to understand how my life had been reduced to a math problem my parents couldn't solve. Dinner came on a plastic tray, and I pushed the food around without eating any of it, because my stomach felt like it was tied in knots. The clock on the wall showed 6:47 p.m. when I heard footsteps in the hallway, and then Jackson appeared in the doorway looking like he hadn't slept in days. His work uniform was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that made him look older than 19. He came in and sat down in the chair beside my bed without saying anything at first, just staring at his hands like he didn't know where to start. Then he blurted out that he'd told Mom he would take out student loans for Columbia, that she didn't have to use the college fund if it meant stopping my treatment. I felt something loosen in my chest for just a second before he kept talking. She'd refused completely, told him the loans would ruin his credit and his future, said I was being dramatic about the whole thing anyway. According to Mom, the treatment probably wouldn't work in the long run, so why waste money that could give him a real chance at success? Jackson's voice cracked when he repeated her words, and I could see his hands shaking. I asked him straight out if he thought his college was worth more than my life, and the question hung in the air between us like something physical. He started crying then, actual tears running down his face while he tried to explain that he didn't know what to do anymore. Mom had controlled every choice he'd ever made, picked his classes and his activities and his friends, told him exactly who he was supposed to be. He said he was scared of disappointing them, but he knew what they were doing to me was wrong, and being caught between those two things was tearing him apart. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, but mostly I just felt tired, because even now he was making this about his feelings instead of my actual survival. He wiped his face with his sleeve and started talking faster, telling me things I didn't know about our family's money situation. Dad's business had been struggling for 2 years, losing clients to bigger companies and barely making enough to cover expenses. They were carrying credit card debt and a second mortgage on the house, drowning in bills that kept piling up. The college fund wasn't really $40,000 anymore, more like $30,000 after they'd borrowed from it to cover emergency repairs and medical bills from when Dad had that health scare last year. Hearing all this made something click into place about why they were panicking so hard about money, but it didn't change the basic fact that they were choosing to let me die instead of figuring something else out. Jackson kept explaining like the debt somehow made their choice reasonable, like being broke gave them permission to sacrifice one kid for the other. I told him that lots of families had money problems and didn't decide to kill their children over it, and he flinched like I'd hit him. We sat there in uncomfortable silence until Judith knocked on the doorframe and came back in carrying a folder. She looked at Jackson and then at me, clearly reading the tension in the room. She asked Jackson if he'd be willing to write a statement about the family situation, about the pattern of favoritism and neglect he'd seen growing up. He hesitated, and I could see him struggling with the idea of going against our parents officially, putting it down in writing where it could be used in court. But then he nodded and said he would write down everything he'd witnessed since we were kids, all the times they'd chosen him over me or forgotten I existed. Judith handed him some papers and a pen, told him to be specific about dates and events if he could remember them. After Jackson left with the papers tucked under his arm, Judith sat down and we talked about what would happen next. She said she'd been making calls all afternoon, getting things ready for the legal steps we'd need to take. The hospital was backing me up completely, which meant I had resources and support that most kids in my situation wouldn't have. That night after Judith left and the nurses finished their evening rounds, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about anything. The phone on my bedside table started ringing around 9 o'clock, and I knew without looking that it was Mom. I let it ring and ring until it went to voicemail, and then I listened to her voice come through the speaker because I was too tired to turn it off. She said I was being selfish and trying to manipulate everyone, that I was trying to destroy Jackson's future out of jealousy because I'd always resented him for being the favorite. She told me I needed to accept reality and stop causing problems for the family, that making them look bad to the hospital and getting social workers involved was just me being spiteful. Her voice was sharp and angry, but there was something underneath it that might have been fear, like she knew what she'd done was wrong but couldn't admit it. The voicemail ended and I deleted it without saving it, then turned the phone's ringer off so she couldn't call again. Sleep didn't come easy that night, and when I finally dozed off, I had dreams about drowning while people stood on the shore watching. Morning came with weak sunlight through the hospital window, and the usual routine of nurses checking my vitals and bringing breakfast I couldn't eat. Judith showed up around 8 carrying coffee and looking determined about something. She had someone with her, a man in his 30s wearing a suit that looked professional but not expensive. She introduced him as Yusuf Saxton, a legal aid attorney who worked with cases involving kids and medical rights. He shook my hand and sat down with the folder Judith had been building, reading through everything carefully while making notes on a yellow legal pad. After about 20 minutes, he looked up and told me we had grounds for an emergency court case. My heart started beating faster because this was really happening. We were actually going to fight my parents in court over whether I got to live. Yusuf explained the whole process in clear terms that didn't talk down to me or try to make it sound simpler than it was. We'd file for temporary authority to make medical choices to be moved from my parents to the hospital, just for now while we worked on something bigger. Then we'd push for limited freedom for healthcare choices until I turned 18 in 7 months, which wasn't full adult rights but would let me say yes to my own treatment. He said it would move fast because this was life or death, that judges took these cases seriously when a kid's survival was on the line. The hospital ethics group scheduled an emergency meeting for the next day, which meant everything was moving faster than I'd expected. That afternoon, a woman named Lila Hansen from the ethics group came to interview me alone, without Judith or Yusuf or any doctors around. She was maybe 50 with gray hair and kind eyes, and she asked me detailed questions about whether I understood what the treatment involved and what would happen if I stopped it. She wanted to know if the doctors were pushing me to continue, or if this was really my own choice, and I could tell she was trying to figure out if I was mature enough to make this decision. I told her I'd been making my own choices since I was 10 years old, deciding what to eat and when to sleep and how to get to the school, because my parents had checked out of raising me a long time ago. The only difference now was that this particular choice would decide if I lived or died, instead of just whether I had clean clothes or a packed lunch. Lila wrote everything down and asked more questions about my relationship with my parents, about Jackson, about how I'd handled being sick. Then she asked what I wanted my future to look like, and I realized with a weird shock that I hadn't let myself think past next month. Survival had felt so impossible that planning for anything beyond it seemed pointless. I told her I wanted to finish high school and maybe go to community college, have a job I didn't hate, and just exist without constantly fighting for scraps of attention from people who were supposed to love me. It sounded so basic when I said it out loud, like the bare minimum of what a life should be, but it was more than I'd ever let myself hope for before. That afternoon, my parents showed up without warning, and I heard them before I saw them because their voices carried down the hallway. They brought a lawyer with them, some older guy in a gray suit who started talking about parental rights and family privacy before he even reached my room. Judith must have been watching for them because she intercepted them right outside my door, and suddenly there were 3 adults arguing in voices that kept getting louder. I sat frozen in my hospital bed listening to Mom say I was being difficult, and the lawyer claimed they had every right to make medical decisions for their minor child. Judith's voice stayed calm but firm, explaining that the hospital had serious concerns about medical neglect, and that an ethics review was already underway. The lawyer threatened something about lawsuits and overreach, and then their voices moved farther down the hall until I couldn't make out words anymore, just angry sounds that made my chest tight. The nurse came in to check my vitals about 20 minutes later, a woman named Sandra who'd been taking care of me for the past week. She adjusted my IV without saying anything at first, but then she glanced at the closed door and spoke quietly. She told me she'd seen this before, parents who couldn't handle the money or the fear or just the exhausting weight of a kid being seriously sick. Some of them convinced themselves that giving up was actually mercy, that they were sparing their child from suffering when really they were just sparing themselves from having to keep fighting. She looked right at me when she said it wasn't my job to make their choices easier by dying when it was convenient for them. Her words hit me hard because nobody had said it that plainly before, that my parents wanted the easy way out and expected me to cooperate. Sandra finished with my IV and left without saying anything else, but I kept thinking about what she'd said while I stared at my phone. Around 6 that evening, Jackson texted me a photo that took a minute to load, and when it finally came through, I saw 3 pages of handwriting on lined paper. He'd written the statement for Judith, and even in the small phone screen, I could read some of it. Every birthday party I didn't get. Every school event they missed. Every time they chose him over me. The words were messy, like he'd been writing fast, or maybe his hand was shaking, and at the end he wrote that he was ashamed he never stood up for me before, and that he'd testify if they needed him to. I saved the photo and then just sat there holding my phone, not sure what to feel about my brother finally seeing what I'd lived through my whole life. That night I couldn't sleep even though the hospital was quiet and my body was exhausted from chemo. I kept thinking about court and lawyers and having to prove that my parents had neglected me, having to convince strangers that I was worth saving. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and opened the notes app on my phone, and I started writing everything down. What it felt like to be the unwanted kid. Walking home alone while Jackson got driven. Buying my own school supplies with babysitting money. The science fair trophy getting wet in the rain. The MIT camp I never got to attend. Packing my own lunches starting in 4th grade. The shrine to Jackson in the living room and my outdated picture on the fridge. I wrote about every forgotten birthday and missed track meet and time they chose his hockey game over anything I needed. The words came fast once I started. Not angry exactly, but just factual. Like I was documenting evidence of something that had always been true, but nobody ever acknowledged. By the time weak morning light started coming through my window, I had 5 pages of single-spaced notes. 17 years of being second choice organized into clear examples that proved a pattern. I felt weird about it, like I was building a case against my own parents. But Judith had said we needed documentation, and this was what I had to offer. The ethics committee met that same day, and Judith came to tell me about it afterward, settling into the chair beside my bed with a tired smile. She said they'd voted unanimously to support the emergency petition, that the evidence of medical neglect and endangerment was clear enough that they felt comfortable backing the legal action. Lila had personally called the family court judge to get the hearing expedited because this was literally life or death timing, and the judge had agreed to schedule something within days instead of weeks. Judith squeezed my hand and told me I was doing everything right, that speaking up for myself took courage most adults never managed. I wanted to feel relieved, but mostly I just felt scared because this was really happening. We were actually taking my parents to court. The next morning, Judith showed me the counter motion that my parents' lawyer had filed overnight, and reading it made me so mad I could barely see straight. Their lawyer claimed I was manipulated by hospital staff who wanted to rack up treatment charges, that doctors were using me to generate profit, and that my parents were making a reasonable decision based on real financial limitations. The accusation that Dr. Stone and Judith were somehow using me felt like a slap, because these people had fought harder for my life than my own parents ever did. Dr. Stone had stayed late multiple times to adjust my treatment plan, and Judith had spent hours helping me navigate systems she didn't have to care about. And now some lawyer was calling them manipulative because they didn't want me to die. Listen to 90 Seconds and rate me 5 stars on Spotify. Doing a giveaway for people who did this and show proof on my Instagram. There will be 4 winners, and you get to choose between a Spotify or Amazon gift card. I showed the motion to Yusuf when he came by later that day, and he barely reacted except to say that desperate people make desperate arguments. He pulled out his yellow legal pad and started walking me through practice questions for court, teaching me how to stay calm and factual even when the other lawyer tried to make me emotional or confused. He said judges saw through manipulation tactics all the time, and that my consistent story across multiple witnesses would be my strongest evidence. We practiced for over an hour, him asking increasingly tough questions about my relationship with my parents, and me learning to answer without getting defensive or crying. By the end, I felt slightly more prepared, but still terrified of having to do this for real. Mallory showed up the next afternoon carrying a big tote bag, and when she dumped it out on my bed, I saw a phone charger, bags of my favorite snacks, 3 magazines, and a card with signatures covering every inch of it. She said everyone at the restaurant where I'd worked had signed it, and they'd taken up a collection that raised $300 toward my treatment. It wasn't much compared to what I needed, but I started crying anyway because people who barely knew me, who just worked shifts alongside me for a few months, cared more about keeping me alive than my parents did. Mallory hugged me while I cried and told me that the whole staff was rooting for me, that they'd been following the situation and wanted to help however they could. She stayed for 2 hours just talking about normal stuff like work gossip and which managers were the worst, giving me a break from thinking about court and cancer and parents who wanted me gone. 3 days after Mom's announcement, I got dressed in real clothes instead of a hospital gown, and Yusuf drove me to the courthouse, a old brick building downtown that smelled like wood polish and anxiety when we walked in. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, just a regular office with a desk for the judge and chairs arranged in rows. I sat next to Yusuf on one side while my parents and their lawyer sat across the aisle, close enough that I could see Mom's face, but she wouldn't look at me at all. Dad stared at his hands, and Jackson wasn't there because Judith said it was better if he stayed out of it unless they needed him to testify. The judge came in and everyone stood up, and then we sat back down and it started. Dr. Stone testified first, walking up to the front with a thick folder of my medical records. He presented everything in clear, simple terms that anyone could understand, explaining that my leukemia was responding well to treatment, but that stopping now would be a death sentence within months. He showed charts of my blood counts improving and explained exactly what the remaining treatment cycles would do, and he stated clearly that completing the protocol gave me excellent odds of long-term survival. When my parents' lawyer tried to suggest that the cancer might come back anyway, Dr. Stone shut that down fast, saying that was true of any cancer patient, but wasn't a reason to stop treating someone whose disease was actively responding to therapy. Judith took the stand next and opened a thick folder that held everything she'd collected over the past week. She walked through her interviews with me, with Jackson, with nurses who'd watched my parents disappear the moment Columbia entered the picture. She read sections from Jackson's 3-page statement about every birthday party I didn't get, every school event they skipped, every time they picked him over me since we were kids. Then she presented my own 5 pages of documentation, 17 years of being the accident they never wanted, and you could see people in the courtroom shifting in their seats. She laid out the pattern so clearly that even my parents' lawyer looked uncomfortable. This whole history of neglect that existed long before cancer made it life or death. The evidence covered the table in front of the judge. Pages and pages proving I'd been raising myself since I was 10 while they poured everything into Jackson. My parents' lawyer stood up and argued that they'd been present throughout my treatment, that Mom had slept in the hospital chairs and Dad had taken time off work. He pointed to the 3 months they'd shown up for chemo appointments like that, erased 17 years of nothing. Yusuf got up for his turn and asked one simple question that cut through everything. He wanted to know why that care stopped the exact moment Jackson's college plans needed money, why my life was worth their attention only until it competed with their favorite child's dreams. The lawyer had no good answer for that, just kept repeating that they'd been there when it mattered. But Yusuf made it clear that if it really mattered, I wouldn't be fighting for treatment in court right now. Then the judge looked at me and said I needed to testify, and my legs felt shaky walking to the front of the room. She asked me directly what I wanted, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. I said I wanted to live, that I wanted to finish the treatment that was working, that my cancer was getting better and stopping now would kill me within months. I told her I understood my parents couldn't or wouldn't pay for it, but that shouldn't mean I had to die, that there had to be other options besides just giving up on me. I kept my eyes on the judge because looking at Mom and Dad felt impossible, and I could feel tears building, but I forced them back because I needed to sound strong enough to deserve saving. The judge turned to my parents and asked if they'd looked into payment plans, charity care, Medicaid, fundraising, anything besides just deciding to stop treatment. Dad admitted they hadn't, because they thought insurance denial meant no other options existed, and the judge's face showed exactly what she thought of that answer. She asked why they hadn't contacted the hospital financial counselors or researched assistance programs, why their first response to a money problem was letting their daughter die. Dad had nothing to say to that, and Mom stared at her hands while the silence stretched out. Mom finally spoke up, her voice shaking, trying to argue that she was protecting me from false hope and making my last months comfortable instead of filled with painful treatment. But even she didn't sound like she believed it, the words coming out wrong like she was reading from a script she'd memorized but never really understood. The judge leaned forward and asked her straight out if she was choosing her son's education over her daughter's life. Mom opened her mouth but nothing came out, and that silence answered everything louder than words could have. You could see her trying to find some way to make it sound reasonable, some explanation that would make sacrificing one child for another seem like good parenting, but there wasn't one, and we all knew it. The judge announced her ruling right there without even leaving to think about it. She granted temporary emergency authority to the hospital to continue my treatment while the full emancipation petition got processed through the system. She ordered my parents to cooperate with Medicaid applications and charity care reviews, to provide whatever financial documentation the hospital needed. The ruling meant I could keep getting chemo no matter what they wanted, that their decision to let me die didn't matter anymore because the court was taking that choice away from them. I felt Yusuf squeeze my shoulder and realized I'd stopped breathing, this wave of relief so strong it made me dizzy. Walking out of the courthouse, Mom tried to approach me, but Yusuf stepped between us before she got close. He reminded her that the order included rules against harassment or trying to pressure me, that she needed to stay back and let me leave without any drama. Dad stood behind her looking defeated. His shoulders slumped like someone had knocked all the fight out of him. Jackson hovered near the courthouse doors, clearly wanting to say something but not knowing what words could possibly help. I walked past all of them with Yusuf guiding me toward his car, not looking back because I didn't trust myself not to break down if I made eye contact. Back at the hospital, Judith met us in her office with a stack of Medicaid paperwork that looked 3 inches thick. She explained we were applying for emergency coverage as a medically needy minor, which meant proving my parents were unable or unwilling to provide necessary care. The forms asked for details about income, assets, household composition, and required documentation of the medical neglect that brought us here. Judith walked me through every section, showing me where to sign and what information she'd already gathered from the court proceedings. My hand cramped from signing my name over and over, each signature another piece of evidence that I was on my own now. Dr. Stone came by while we were finishing the paperwork and scheduled my next chemo cycle for 3 days out. He said the hospital's charity care committee would review my case for financial assistance that could cover whatever gaps Medicaid didn't handle. He looked genuinely relieved that treatment could continue without stopping, like he'd been carrying the weight of my potential death and could finally put it down. He told me my counts were still improving, and that if we stayed on track, I'd finish the full protocol right around graduation, maybe even walk across that stage to get my diploma. That night, Jackson showed up at my hospital room and we sat in silence for a while, neither of us knowing how to start a conversation after everything that happened in court. Finally, he said he'd told Columbia he was deferring enrollment for a year, that he needed time to work and save money before starting college. He tried to make it sound like a practical decision, but we both knew what it really meant, that he was stepping back from the situation that almost killed me. He couldn't go to Columbia knowing it was purchased with my life, couldn't sit in those classes without thinking about the chemo I wouldn't have gotten if the court hadn't intervened. I wanted to tell him he didn't have to sacrifice his future to prove he was sorry, but maybe he needed to do this for himself, to know he'd chosen differently than our parents when it mattered. I told Jackson he didn't have to give up his future just to prove something, that he could still go to Columbia if that's what he really wanted. He shook his head and said he'd already looked into state schools with better financial aid, that maybe this was actually better for everyone in the long run. He couldn't sit in those Columbia classrooms knowing the tuition almost cost me my life, couldn't enjoy the experience with that weight hanging over everything. I wanted to argue, but I understood, because I'd spent 17 years carrying guilt that wasn't mine to carry, and I recognized that look on his face. The next morning, Mallory showed up with a stack of folders and a determined expression, explaining that she'd talked to my teachers about setting up remote learning so I could finish senior year from the hospital. She'd printed out all my assignments for the next month and gotten study guides from kids in my classes. Then she pulled out a calendar she'd made with a rotating schedule of coworkers who volunteered to drive me to appointments, people from the restaurant who barely knew me but wanted to help anyway. She'd created an entire support system from scratch, filling in the gaps my parents left with people who had zero obligation to care. I stared at that calendar with 12 different names on it and felt something crack open in my chest, because this was what actual support looked like. 2 weeks after the court hearing, Judith came by with news that the Medicaid application got expedited approval, covering most of my treatment costs going forward, plus some of the bills we'd already racked up. She explained that the medical neglect documentation made my case a priority for emergency services, that the system moved faster when there was clear evidence of a minor being endangered. Between Medicaid and what the hospital might cover, we were looking at my treatment being fully funded without a single dollar from my parents. The relief was so intense I felt dizzy, because for the first time since Mom's announcement, I could actually believe I might survive this. 3 days later, a formal letter arrived through my parents' lawyer requesting supervised visitation, full of language about wanting to repair our relationship and work toward reconciliation. Yusuf came by that evening to review it with me and explained I could set whatever boundaries I needed, that I was under no obligation to see them before I was ready. I thought about it for maybe 30 seconds before telling him I wasn't ready, that I needed time to just focus on getting through treatment without the added stress of managing their emotions. He nodded and said he'd communicate that to their attorney, that my healing came first. The hospital charity committee met the following week, and Judith called to tell me they'd approved coverage for all my remaining out-of-pocket costs, after reviewing the court documents and my financial situation. She walked me through the breakdown, showing how Medicaid covered the bulk of treatment while charity care filled in the gaps for things like certain medications and additional testing. My cancer treatment was now completely funded without my parents' money, paid for by systems designed to protect kids whose families failed them. I sat with that information for a long time, trying to process that I'd actually done it, that I'd fought for my own survival and won. When they started my next chemo cycle, I felt physically terrible, the nausea and exhaustion hitting harder than previous rounds. But emotionally, I was stronger than I'd been in months. This treatment was happening because I fought for it, not because anyone gave it to me out of love or obligation. The independence was lonely in a way I hadn't expected, because part of me still wanted parents who cared enough to fight for me instead of making me fight alone. But this was mine, this survival, and nobody could take it away or use it as leverage. Jackson started visiting every week, usually on Thursday evenings after his grocery store shift, and we'd sit in my hospital room talking about normal things like his coworkers and my remote classes. We were slowly rebuilding something that wasn't quite sibling affection, but wasn't hostile either, finding a middle ground where we could exist in the same space without the weight of our parents' choices crushing everything. He told me about applying to community colleges and looking for full-time work, making plans that didn't revolve around Columbia or Mom's expectations. I realized we were both learning to exist outside our parents' control for the first time, figuring out who we were when we weren't performing our assigned roles. A month after the emergency hearing, Yusuf filed the formal petition for limited medical emancipation, which would give me legal authority to make my own healthcare decisions until I turned 18 in 7 months. He explained the hearing was scheduled 6 weeks out to give everyone time to prepare, though he expected it to go smoothly since my parents weren't contesting, and we had strong documentation. The petition felt like the final piece, the legal framework that would protect me even after the emergency order expired. I signed the papers in Yusuf's office while he explained what each section meant, my hand cramping from writing my signature over and over. At my next appointment, Dr. Stone reviewed my latest blood work with barely contained excitement, explaining that my cancer markers were continuing to improve at a rate that exceeded their initial projections. He said if this trajectory held, I'd complete treatment in about 4 months, with an excellent prognosis for long-term remission. Hearing that I might actually survive this, that I might have years instead of months, made me realize I needed to start planning for a future I'd never let myself imagine. I'd been so focused on just getting through each day that I hadn't thought about what comes after, what kind of life I wanted to build once I wasn't fighting cancer anymore. That night, I lay in my hospital bed thinking about college applications and career possibilities, about the person I might become if I got the chance. The school counselor called the next week, and we set up a video meeting where she walked me through a plan for completing senior year through online classes and hospital tutoring. She'd arranged for teachers to send assignments electronically, and scheduled weekly check-ins to make sure I stayed on track. With this setup, I'd graduate on time despite missing months of in-person attendance, would walk across that stage in June and receive my diploma like everything was normal. Having a plan that extended beyond just surviving felt revolutionary, like I was finally allowed to think about a future that included me in it. Mallory showed up the next afternoon with her laptop and a list of remote job sites she'd researched. She pulled a chair up to my hospital bed and started walking me through application forms for data entry positions, helping me figure out how to explain my situation without making employers nervous about my availability. We spent 3 hours filling out applications and uploading my resume, which looked pretty thin since most of my work experience was waitressing at the restaurant where she still worked. She kept encouraging me when I got frustrated, reminding me that any income was better than none, and that plenty of companies hired remote workers specifically because they needed flexible people. By the end of the day, I'd submitted applications to 12 different companies, everything from medical billing data entry to customer service chat support. The process felt good, like I was building something for myself instead of just surviving what other people decided for me. 2 days later, I got an email from a medical records company offering me part-time work entering patient information into their database system. The pay was minimum wage and I could only work 15 hours a week because of my treatment schedule, but it was mine. I signed the contract on my phone while waiting for my next round of blood work, feeling like I'd just won something important, even though it was just a basic data entry job that most people wouldn't want. A week after that, Yusuf called to tell me my parents' lawyer had requested a mediation session before the full emancipation hearing. He explained that mediation was voluntary and I could refuse, but that it might help establish my willingness to maintain some kind of relationship with them, which could look good to the judge. I talked it over with Judith during one of our weekly check-ins, and she said she'd be willing to supervise the session if I decided to go through with it. The idea of sitting in a room with my parents made my stomach hurt, but I also knew I couldn't avoid them forever, especially with Jackson still living at home and trying to navigate between us. I agreed to one session with the understanding that Judith would be there the whole time, and I could leave whenever I wanted. They scheduled it for the following Tuesday in a small conference room at the hospital, neutral territory where I felt safer than I would have anywhere else. The morning of the mediation, I threw up twice from nerves that had nothing to do with chemo. Judith met me outside the conference room and walked in with me, her hand on my shoulder in a way that felt protective without being controlling. Mom and Dad were already sitting on one side of the table with their lawyer, and I took the seat directly across from them with Judith beside me. The air felt thick and wrong, like we were all breathing different oxygen. Their lawyer started with some formal statement about everyone being here in good faith to work toward family healing, but I barely heard it because I was watching Mom's face. She looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that went deeper than just lack of sleep, and for a second I almost felt bad for her. Then I remembered her sitting on my hospital bed telling me Jackson's dorm room was more important than my life, and the sympathy disappeared. Mom started crying before anyone even asked her to speak, tears running down her face while she apologized for not handling things better. She said she'd been so scared when I got sick, so overwhelmed by the medical bills and the insurance fights and watching me suffer through chemo. She talked about how hard it had been for her, how she didn't sleep for months, how she felt like she was drowning in impossible choices. Every sentence circled back to her own pain, her own fear, her own struggle to cope with my illness. She said she knew she'd made mistakes, but that I had to understand how terrified she'd been, how the pressure of keeping our family afloat financially had crushed her. I sat there listening to her make my cancer about her suffering, and I realized she wanted me to comfort her. She wanted forgiveness without actually acknowledging that she'd been willing to let me die, so Jackson could go to his dream school. She wanted me to say it was okay, that I understood, that we could go back to being a family. But she never once said the specific words that mattered, never admitted that she'd chosen Jackson over me, never took responsibility for the fact that her financial panic had almost killed me. Dad barely talked, just sat there looking at his hands while Mom cried and explained and justified. When their lawyer finally asked if he had anything to add, He cleared his throat and said they'd made terrible choices out of panic and desperation. He admitted that watching me fight so hard for my own life, seeing me hire a lawyer and go to court and refuse to just accept dying quietly, had made him realize how completely they'd failed me as parents. His voice cracked when he said it, and I could tell he actually meant it, which somehow made it worse. If he knew they'd failed me, if he could see it clearly enough to say it out loud, then why hadn't he stopped it from happening? Why had it taken me nearly dying and then fighting them in court for him to acknowledge what Jackson and I had both lived with our entire lives? It was the closest thing to real accountability I'd gotten from either of them, but it still felt hollow because it came too late, after I'd already had to save myself. I let them finish talking and then told them I didn't know if I could ever have a normal parent-child relationship with them. I said I was willing to have supervised contact if they respected my boundaries and stopped trying to control my medical decisions, but that I needed them to understand I might never trust them again. I explained that they'd spent 17 years showing me I didn't matter, and 3 months of hospital visits during my cancer treatment didn't erase that. I told them the emancipation wasn't about punishing them. It was about protecting myself from people who'd proven they'd sacrifice me when it was convenient. Mom looked devastated, her face crumpling like I'd physically hurt her, but she nodded and agreed to whatever boundaries I needed. Dad just said he understood and that he'd respect my choices. Their lawyer made notes about our agreement to maintain limited supervised contact, and then the session was over. I walked out feeling empty and tired, like I'd just run a marathon that nobody else could see. The full emancipation hearing happened 6 weeks later on a cold morning in March. I wore the nicest clothes I owned, which wasn't saying much, and Yusuf met me outside the courthouse to go over everything one last time. He told me my parents weren't planning to contest the petition, that their lawyer had filed a statement saying they supported my right to make my own medical decisions, and would cooperate with my ongoing care. It felt like too little too late, this sudden cooperation after months of fighting, but at least it meant we wouldn't have to go through another battle in front of a judge. We walked into the courtroom together, and I saw my parents sitting in the back row, not at the defendant's table this time. Jackson was with them, and he gave me a small nod that I returned. The judge was a different woman than the one who'd handled the emergency hearing, older with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. The hearing itself was quick and almost boring compared to the emergency petition. Yusuf presented all the documentation we'd compiled, the medical records and treatment plans and financial arrangements that proved I could manage my own health care. Their lawyer read the statement about my parents supporting the petition and agreeing to respect my medical autonomy. The judge asked me a few questions about my understanding of the responsibility I was taking on, and I answered honestly that I'd been taking care of myself for most of my life already. This just made it legal. She reviewed the paperwork for what felt like forever, then announced she was granting limited medical emancipation effective immediately and lasting until my 18th birthday in 7 months. She said that at that point I'd have full adult rights anyway, but this gave me the legal authority I needed now. Then she looked directly at me and said I'd shown more maturity and self-advocacy than many adults she saw in her courtroom, and that she hoped I'd continue to fight for myself with the same strength I'd demonstrated throughout this process. I thanked her and walked out of the courthouse legally free to make my own medical decisions, no longer dependent on parents who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with my life. With the legal authority secured and treatment funded through Medicaid and charity care, I could finally focus on just getting through chemo without constantly fighting for the right to receive it. The physical side effects were still brutal, the nausea and exhaustion and hair loss that made me feel like my body was betraying me. But it was manageable when I wasn't also battling my family, when I could just concentrate on surviving each treatment cycle without worrying that someone would pull the funding or try to stop my care. Dr. Stone adjusted my anti-nausea medications, and we found a combination that actually worked, letting me keep food down most days. The nurses knew me by name now and would bring me warm blankets without me asking, small kindnesses that reminded me not everyone in the world was trying to hurt me. I started keeping a journal of my symptoms and side effects, tracking what helped and what made things worse, taking control of my treatment in ways that felt empowering instead of scary. Judith helped me arrange transitional housing through a program for medically complex teens, a small apartment about 10 minutes from the hospital where I could live independently with case management support. The program provided furniture and helped with rent, and a social worker would check in twice a week to make sure I was managing okay. Moving out of my parents' house happened on a Saturday when they were deliberately gone, some previously planned trip to visit relatives that gave us the space to pack without confrontation. Jackson showed up early with his car, and we loaded my belongings into boxes, which didn't take long because I'd never accumulated much. My clothes fit in 2 boxes, my books in 3 more, and my personal items barely filled a backpack. We worked in silence mostly, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between us. He carried boxes down to his car while I took one last look at the room where I'd spent 17 years feeling invisible. There was nothing worth keeping here, no memories I wanted to take with me. Jackson drove me to the new apartment and helped me unpack, setting up my bed and arranging my books on the small shelf. Before he left, he hugged me, and said he was sorry for not protecting me when we were kids. And then I told him we were both just trying to survive and that I didn't blame him for our parents' choices. He left and I sat in my new apartment alone, finally independent in a way that felt real and permanent. I completed my next to last chemo cycle 3 weeks after moving into the apartment, and Dr. Stone reviewed my blood work with barely hidden excitement. He said my counts were staying strong, and if this trajectory held, I'd finish treatment right around graduation in June. The timeline felt surreal. The idea that I might actually walk across that stage and receive my diploma like a normal person. I'd been doing my schoolwork through online classes and hospital tutoring, keeping up with assignments even on days when I felt too sick to sit up properly. My teachers had been understanding about extensions and modified workload, but I'd insisted on doing the actual work myself, refusing to accept pity grades that I hadn't earned. The school counselor called to confirm I was on track to graduate on time and asked if I wanted to participate in the ceremony. I said yes without hesitation, because after everything I'd been through, I deserved to wear that cap and gown and prove I'd survived. Mom and Dad started coming to supervised visits every other Tuesday at the hospital, where Judith kept an office for exactly these situations. We'd sit in uncomfortable chairs around a small table and talk about weather, Dad's work projects, Mom's book club, anything that didn't require actual emotional honesty. They asked surface questions about my health, and I gave surface answers about blood counts and side effects. Nobody mentioned Columbia or Jackson's college plans, or the court hearing that had stripped them of medical authority over me. The visits lasted exactly 1 hour, and then we'd all leave, having maintained civility without achieving anything close to healing. I accepted this arrangement because stable felt better than the chaos of fighting, even if stable meant keeping them at arm's length forever. Judith sat in on every visit taking notes, and sometimes I caught her watching Mom with this expression like she was documenting a specimen, clinical and detached. After 6 weeks of these meetings, I realized this pattern might be permanent, that I'd reached the maximum closeness my parents could offer, and I had to decide if limited contact was better than none. I chose limited because cutting them off completely felt like letting them win, like proving I was as disposable as they'd always treated me. Jackson texted me one Thursday afternoon with news that changed his whole trajectory. He'd gotten accepted to the state university with a partial academic scholarship that covered half his tuition, way more than anyone expected given his grades. He planned to study business and live at home to save money on housing, which meant staying in that house with our parents while I'd escape to my own place. When he came by my apartment that weekend to tell me in person, he looked different somehow, lighter and less tense around his shoulders. He said turning down Columbia had felt terrible at first, but then started feeling like relief, like he'd been carrying weight that wasn't actually his to carry. I realized our parents had been crushing him too, just in different ways, making him into their success story whether he wanted that role or not. He talked about his classes and internship plans with actual excitement instead of the forced enthusiasm he'd always used about Columbia. Watching him figure out what he wanted separate from what they wanted reminded me that we'd both been surviving the same house, just with different survival strategies. One quiet evening in my apartment after a long day of feeling mostly okay, I cleared space on the small bookshelf near my window. I set up my old science fair trophy first, the one I'd carried home in the rain at 8 years old when nobody came to get me. Next to it, I placed my acceptance letter to the MIT summer program, still crisp in its envelope because I'd saved it even though I never got to go. Then I added the court documents from my emancipation hearing, official papers with the judge's signature that proved I'd fought for my own life and won. These 3 things together told my whole story, proof that I'd always been worth fighting for even when I had to be the one doing the fighting. I stepped back and looked at this little shrine to my own survival, so different from the shrine my parents built for Jackson in their living room. Mine celebrated the times I'd saved myself instead of waiting for someone else to save me. So yeah, that is about it. Nothing too serious, just another story worth talking about. Thanks for hanging out. It always feels easy spending a few minutes together. Catch you next time if you stop by.